Imagine waking up one morning and realizing the sun has vanished, not gone completely, but dimmed, as if someone had draped a veil across the heavens. A pale disk, cold and weak, hanging over a world that had lost its warmth. The year was 536 AD, and it would be remembered as the year when the earth itself seemed to stop breathing. Across continents, day turned to twilight. For 18 long months, the light never returned to its full strength. The air grew heavy, dry, gray, and filled with something strange. The sky burned with a copper hue at noon, and at dusk it faded to black. Birds stopped singing, crops withered in the fields, snow fell in the middle of summer. In Constantinople, a scribe stood on the steps of Hagia Sophia and looked up at the dying sky. He wrote, "The sun gave forth its light without brightness, like the moon during the whole year." In China, the imperial astronomers recorded that the sun was bluish and frost destroyed the fields. In Ireland, monks wrote of a failure of bread from the years 536 to 539. Everywhere, from Rome to Beijing, the same fear took root. The world was darkening, and no one knew why. People prayed. They fasted. They lit candles in temples and churches, begging the heavens for forgiveness. But the light never came back. Children stared at the dim horizon and asked their mothers if the sun was dying, and no one could answer. Entire harvests failed. Livestock starved. Famine spread like wildfire. By the second year, hunger had turned to despair. In villages across Europe, families buried their dead in shallow graves because the ground was too frozen to dig. In the north, entire communities vanished, leaving behind only tools and silent hearths buried in frost. Modern science would later reveal what they could not. A massive volcanic eruption, perhaps in Iceland, had filled the stratosphere with ash and sulfur. The earth was shrouded in a veil of dust so thick that sunlight could barely reach the ground. Global temperatures fell by 3 degrees. The winds shifted, rain patterns collapsed, and humanity stood on the edge of extinction. But to those who lived it, there was no science, only faith, fear, and the feeling that something divine had broken. In the Byzantine Empire, Emperor Justinian had been rebuilding Rome's glory. Grand cathedrals, armies, laws, a new golden age. Then the sky turned gray. His empire trembled. Trade halted. Crops failed. Dreams of conquest turned to nightmares of survival. In the north, the Norse saw the darkness and called it a prophecy. The coming of Ragnarok, the twilight of the gods. In the east, Chinese philosophers spoke of heaven's anger. In the west, priests warned that Judgment Day had begun. The sun became a dying ember in a world of ash. And for the first time, humanity faced the terrifying idea that nature itself had turned against them. It wasn't just a season. It wasn't just famine. It was the unraveling of the world. The moment when the old age of light ended and the dark centuries began. One anonymous monk wrote, "The world grew old, the air was heavy, and men lost the warmth of their hearts." The year 536 marked not just a disaster, but a rebirth through fire and shadow. Civilizations would fall, empires would crumble, and out of this darkness, a new world would slowly, painfully begin to emerge. But in that moment, as the pale sun hovered above a dying earth, one question echoed across every land, in every tongue. Had the end already begun? For centuries, the cause of the darkness of 536 remained a mystery. To those who lived through it, it was the wrath of the gods. To later generations, it became legend, a story whispered by monks and travelers about the year when the sun forgot to rise. But now, we know the truth. Deep beneath the polar ice of Greenland and Antarctica, scientists uncovered the frozen memory of that catastrophe. A thick layer of volcanic ash, sulfur, and glass, a silent witness to a disaster that changed the planet. Somewhere in the far north, perhaps in Iceland, the Earth had torn itself open. A colossal eruption, so vast that its smoke climbed into the stratosphere, blotting out the sun. Ash and sulfuric clouds wrapped around the globe, scattering the light, turning the sky to metal and the air to dust. The sun no longer burned. It glowed faintly, like an ember fading in the ashes of a dead fire. And for the people below, it was as if the heavens themselves had cracked. Days passed in twilight. Nights fell without end. The horizon bled red at noon, then dimmed to black before evening. Even shadows lost their shape, stretching endlessly across a colorless world. Temperatures plunged. The seasons collapsed. It snowed in summer. In Europe, fields froze solid before the harvest. In China, frost burned the rice paddies. In South America, the rains failed. From one pole to another, the entire earth trembled. Imagine standing in a small village beneath that lifeless sky. The smoke of hearth fires hangs motionless in the air. The air smells of ash and wet earth. You can't tell if it's morning or dusk. The only light comes from your own fire. And even that seems weak, swallowed by the darkness above. A mother wraps her child in rags and whispers that the sun will return. A farmer looks at the black soil beneath his feet and realizes nothing will ever grow again. A priest rings the church bell to summon hope, but no one comes. Ancient chroniclers wrote of a veil drawn across the world. A poet in the East said, "The heavens turned to iron and the earth became ash." To them, this was not merely nature's rage. It was the unraveling of creation itself. But nature was not finished. After the eruption of 536 came another, only a few years later, perhaps in Central America or Indonesia, doubling the chaos. The two explosions together plunged the planet into what scientists now call the late antique Little Ice Age. For decades, the sun remained pale. Crops struggled to grow. Rain came at the wrong time, or not at all. Famine spread across continents. Entire civilizations began to break under the weight of endless cold. And then, silence. No birds, no laughter. Only the wind moving through abandoned fields. The world had entered its quietest century. But the earth was not done punishing mankind. From the darkness of the ports and cities, from the rats that followed trade ships, something else began to rise. Silent, invisible, unstoppable. It carried death not in the sky, but in the blood. The world had survived the ash, but now it would face something far worse. The plague was coming. When the skies darkened and the cold took hold, it wasn't only people who began to die, it was civilizations. The world that had once thrived under the light of empire was unraveling, piece by piece, in silence and snow. In Constantinople, Emperor Justinian sat in a palace built of marble and gold, a ruler of the most powerful empire on earth. Only a few years earlier, he had dreamed of restoring the glory of Rome. His armies had conquered North Africa and marched into Italy. His architects had raised the Hagia Sophia, a dome so vast it seemed to touch heaven. And now, the heavens were closing. The markets grew empty, the granaries hollow. Ships no longer came from Egypt because there was no grain left to send. Famine swept through the Byzantine world like a cold wind through open doors. Even the imperial treasury began to bleed. the coins of empire losing their shine, their weight, their worth. In the streets of Constantinople, the poor starved first, then the soldiers, then the priests. Every day, carts carried the dead from the alleys to the city walls, and above it all, the sun still refused to shine. Far to the north, in the forests of Scandinavia, the Norse saw the same endless twilight. They told stories of Ragnarok, the twilight of the gods, the sun and moon devoured by wolves, the world burning in darkness and ice. And when archaeologists uncovered those ancient lands centuries later, they found it was true, not the myth, but the silence. Hundreds of farms abandoned, tools left mid-work. A whole generation vanished between one harvest and the next. In Britain, kingdoms collapsed as famine spread. In Ireland, chronicles record years without bread, years without light. In Persia, war turned to ruin as entire armies starved before they could fight. And in China, dynasties weakened under waves of frost, locusts, and despair. Even far across the ocean, the Maya and the Moche recorded strange signs in the sky: red suns, endless droughts, broken harvests. The world had become a single stage of suffering. Trade routes died. Caravans stopped moving. Ports fell silent. The arteries of the ancient world, the Silk Road, the spice routes, the grain fleets, went still. The global economy, fragile and interwoven, simply stopped. With famine came migration. Hungry tribes moved south, desperate for food and warmth. Villages turned into ghost towns. Empires turned into ruins. The world map itself began to blur. And then, in the shadow of all this despair, something new began to spread. Invisible, relentless, born in the filth of rats and the bite of fleas. A second disaster, quieter, but far deadlier, was about to arrive. The plague of Justinian, a sickness that would finish what the darkness had begun. The ash had settled. The sky remained pale and cold, a ghostly canvas where the sun no longer burned as before. The world did not end in 536, but it never truly recovered either. For nearly a century after the Great Darkness, the earth whispered with famine, silence, and fear. The generation that survived spoke of a time when the sky gave no warmth and the land gave no life. Their children grew up never knowing what abundance meant. In the north, once proud villages turned to ruins. Farmers buried their plows and followed herds south. The great cities of the old world, Rome, Antioch, Alexandria, shrank into shadowed shells of their former selves. Trade dwindled, roads grew wild, and the memory of light itself began to fade into legend. Chronicles from Ireland and China describe years when harvests failed again and again. The grain rotted in the fields, wrote one scribe, and the people looked to the heavens for mercy that never came. In the mountains of Scandinavia, entire settlements vanished, their homes swallowed by moss and silence. Across the Mediterranean, ships lay rotting in abandoned harbors, their cargo long forgotten. It was as if humanity had drawn a collective breath and refused to exhale. This was the silent century, a time when history seemed to pause, and the world, like a wounded beast, limped into survival. But even in the stillness, seeds of change began to stir. The collapse of old empires made room for something new. Nomads and traders from Central Asia began carving fresh paths through the wastelands. In Arabia, new faiths whispered through the desert winds. In the cold lands of Europe, small kingdoms forged identities from the ashes of empire. And in the East, the Tang dynasty was preparing to rise, a phoenix in waiting. Yet for most of the world, life was not rebirth. It was endurance. Villages lived season to season, praying only that the next harvest might not fail. Families told stories by dim firelight, trying to remember what the sun once felt like. And somewhere, perhaps, a child looked up at the pale sky and wondered if the warmth would ever return. The darkness of 536 had passed, but its echo still haunted the bones of the world. The darkness had lasted for years. The cold had claimed millions, but the world's torment was not over. From the shadows of famine and fear came something even worse, silent, invisible, and unstoppable. It began, like all great plagues do, in whispers. A fever in the port of Pelusium on the Nile Delta. A few sailors coughing, a dock worker with black swellings beneath his arms. Then, a city fell silent, bodies piled in the streets, and from there, the plague spread like wildfire. The year was 541 AD. The same Emperor Justinian who had survived the darkness of 536 now faced an even greater horror. The disease would bear his name, the plague of Justinian. It came on ships, on rats, on fleas hidden in the grain sacks of starving empires. Each vessel that brought food to the capital carried death instead. And when the plague reached Constantinople, the beating heart of the Byzantine world, there was no escape. Contemporary witnesses tell us what they saw. Procopius, the court historian, wrote that men suddenly took ill, and at first they had fever. Then black swellings appeared in the groin and under the arms, and many died within a day. He wrote that the city's death toll reached 10,000 every single day. Imagine that. A city where the sound of crying never stops, where carts rumble endlessly through narrow streets, piled high with bodies, where even the priests have stopped burying the dead because there is no ground left to cover them. The emperor himself fell ill. Fever, delirium, the swellings, the buboes that marked the curse. For days, the empire held its breath as its ruler hovered between life and death. He survived, but the world he ruled did not. The plague tore through Constantinople, then spread across the Mediterranean. Egypt, Syria, Italy. Byzantine ships carried it to every port. From there, it leapt to Europe, to Africa, to Asia. It traveled faster than armies, faster than messengers. And wherever it went, civilization followed it into the grave. Farmers died in their fields, merchants in their shops, monks in their cloisters. Cities emptied, the roads filled with ghosts. Procopius wrote that whole villages were wiped out as if by fire. He described officials unable to keep count of the dead, numbers lost, history erased. Some believed the plague was carried by demons. Others thought the earth itself had become diseased. The dead were everywhere, on the docks, in temples, along riverbanks. Grave diggers abandoned their tools and fled. The imperial palace sealed its gates, and yet the rats kept coming. From the grain ships, from the warehouses, from the streets. The world was rotting from the inside out. Within a few years, half of Constantinople's population was gone. Across the empire, tens of millions. Trade collapsed, armies disbanded, borders dissolved. The empire that had once dreamed of restoring Rome now struggled just to survive the week. Even after the fever passed, its shadow remained. The fields were empty, the cities half deserted, the coins in the market worthless because no one was left to spend them. The plague had not just killed people, it had killed confidence, ambition, and hope. And yet, somehow, life went on. A few survivors returned to the streets. Children played among the ruins. Merchants reopened their shops. The world tried to heal, but it would never be the same again. The plague of Justinian had changed everything: economies, armies, faith itself. It marked the true end of antiquity and the birth of a darker, harder age. When the light finally returned to the world, it shone upon empty lands and silent empires. And in that silence, a new chapter of history began, written not by kings or conquerors, but by those who simply managed to survive. When the world grows silent, faith begins to speak. But in the century after the darkness, faith did not whisper, it screamed. Across the ruined empires, people searched for meaning in the void the sun had left behind. Why had the sky turned cold? Why had God, or the gods, abandoned them? Priests, prophets, and madmen all claimed to know the answer. In the Byzantine Empire, church bells rang not for celebration, but for repentance. Monks wandered through the streets in rags, beating their chests, crying that the end of days had come. They said the plagues and the cold were punishment for pride, for daring to rebuild Rome. In the West, among the broken remnants of Europe, strange cults arose. Some worshipped the darkness itself, believing it was the true face of divinity, silent, eternal, unfeeling. Others sought purity through pain, flagellating themselves until blood soaked the snow. They begged heaven to see their suffering and bring back the light. And beyond the Mediterranean, in the deserts of Arabia, a new voice began to rise, speaking not of despair, but revelation. From solitude and vision came words that would one day shape half the world. Out of the silence of one age, a new faith was born. In India and China, sages looked inward instead of upward. They saw the catastrophe not as divine wrath, but as balance restored, a cycle of destruction and renewal. From their philosophies would come new schools of thought, new art, new order. But not all who searched found comfort. Many lost themselves to visions and fear. Chroniclers tell of fire prophets wandering through the Balkans and Anatolia, wild-eyed men claiming to see angels in the ash, promising salvation that never came. In the ruins of Antioch, a priest wrote, "We prayed until our voices broke, but heaven stayed silent." Perhaps heaven, too, was dead. The dark century gave birth to both enlightenment and madness. For every monastery that preserved the light of knowledge, a dozen temples burned in superstition. For every prophet who spoke of hope, another promised fire and doom. And yet, through all the chaos, faith became humanity's final defense, its weapon against the void. It gave shape to fear, gave words to silence, and carried people through nights that seemed endless. When reason failed, belief endured. And when the sun finally rose again, faith, transformed, fractured, reborn, was waiting. For centuries, the year 536 lived in legend. The dark year, the year without sun. No one understood why the sky had dimmed or why the earth had nearly frozen. To those who endured it, it was divine punishment. To historians, it was myth. But today, science has given us the truth. High in the frozen deserts of Greenland and Antarctica, the answers were buried in ice. Each layer, a thin slice of history, one year after another. And there, deep within the ice cores, scientists found it. A layer thick with sulfur, ash, and microscopic shards of volcanic glass. The chemical fingerprint of a cataclysm. When this layer was compared to others across the world, from Swiss glaciers to lake sediments in China, they all told the same story. A massive volcanic eruption, likely in Iceland, had shaken the planet. It blasted millions of tons of sulfur dioxide into the stratosphere, creating a mirror that blocked out the sun. For the people below, it was a nightmare. For the planet, it was physics. The fine particles scattered sunlight, dimming the sky by up to 30%. Global temperatures fell by 3 degrees. It was enough to trigger crop failures, famine, and decades of chaos. And it wasn't over. In 540, another eruption followed, perhaps in Central America or Indonesia, reinforcing the global cold. The atmosphere remained filled with dust for more than 10 years. The sun stayed pale. The rains faltered. The Earth, in a sense, went into shock. Modern climatologists call it the late antique Little Ice Age. It lasted for more than a century. Winters were longer, harvests shorter. The once thriving empires of late antiquity began to crumble under the weight of scarcity and disease. And while nature was the architect, humanity paid the price. In the last 2 decades, scientists have recreated this ancient disaster in laboratories and computer models. They simulated the spread of aerosols through the stratosphere, how they drifted across hemispheres, cooled oceans, shifted winds, and altered the path of monsoons in India, rain belts in Africa, and trade winds across the Atlantic. The results were staggering. One eruption, had changed the entire circulation of the Earth's climate, and it had done so in an age when humanity was utterly defenseless. Even the smallest change in sunlight can alter everything we depend on: food, water, stability. A few degrees colder, a few months without rain, and civilization itself begins to break apart. It's no wonder ancient people turned to the divine for answers. They had no science, no satellites, no understanding of the sky. They looked up at a sun that refused to shine and saw judgment. Today, we look up and see data. But the truth is not so different. The forces that ended the ancient world still exist, beneath our feet, inside our atmosphere, waiting. Volcanoes are the lungs of the planet. When they exhale, the world changes. And sometimes, that breath is enough to wipe the slate clean. In the year 536, nature reminded humanity who truly ruled the earth. And that reminder still echoes in the ice, in the ash, and in the silence of forgotten empires. For more than 1,000 years, the story of 536 was half forgotten, a whisper buried under layers of myth and prayer. Chronicles spoke of a sun without warmth, of a mist that devoured the sky, but few believed such horror could be real, until the earth itself began to speak. High in the ice of Greenland and Antarctica, scientists drilled deep into frozen time. Each layer of ice, a year, a heartbeat, a memory. And there, between the layers of the 6th century, they found it, a scar. A sudden surge of volcanic ash and sulfur, frozen in crystal for over 14 centuries. The planet had remembered what humanity had tried to forget. Those tiny fragments of glass told a story more vivid than any ancient text. Massive eruptions, perhaps in Iceland or North America, had thrown ash high into the stratosphere. The veil of dust encircled the globe, dimming the sun, cooling the earth, and twisting weather for decades. It was not a metaphor. It was physics, pure, merciless, and inescapable. Tree rings confirmed it. Across Europe and Asia, growth nearly stopped. Centuries later, the trunks still bore the mark of starvation, a century of slow-motion pain, written in wood. And in the deep sediments of lakes, a black layer lay quietly, the soot of burning fields and frozen forests. Science, at last, had heard the echoes of the lost world. Every drill core, every microscopic grain of dust was a voice from that vanished century, whispering, "We were here, we suffered, Remember us. Archaeologists joined the search. In Scandinavia, they unearthed ghost farms, homes abandoned mid-harvest, tools left in frozen soil. In the Andes, skeletons showed traces of malnutrition from the same years. Across the Pacific, Chinese records described yellow skies and failed monsoons. It was all connected. One planet, one catastrophe, one silence shared by all. The dark year was no legend. It was global. And in the cold archives of ice and ash, the Earth had preserved its confession. Even now, as satellites orbit the sky, we measure the same elements: sulfur, ash, carbon, rising again from modern eruptions. We can see the fingerprints of 536 repeating in miniature. The difference is, this time, we can understand them. In the frozen veins of the planet, the past still breathes. Every flake of ice, every ring of a tree, every grain of dust, they all whisper the same truth. That history never disappears. It only waits to be rediscovered. After years of darkness, famine, and death, something remarkable happened. Humanity endured. The sun began to return. Weak at first, pale and uncertain, but it was light nonetheless. Fields that had turned to dust slowly came back to life. Grain sprouted again in the valleys. Children were born who had never known warmth and now felt it for the first time. In Constantinople, the fires of the plague smoldered out. Survivors stepped from their homes, blinking against the light. The city that had once buried thousands a day now heard the sound of hammers rebuilding walls. The Byzantine Empire, scarred and smaller, still stood. In the north, abandoned villages began to stir again. New generations tilled the frozen soil. Across Europe, people learned to adapt, changing crops, rationing food, seeking new lands. In China, farmers moved to warmer regions. In the Middle East, new trade routes rose from the ashes of the old. Civilization, though broken, was finding its pulse again. It wasn't strength that saved them. It was persistence. Humans built fires when the sky went dark. They told stories when there was nothing left to eat. They clung to faith when reason failed them. And in doing so, they discovered something deeper than survival: resilience. Out of collapse came change. The old world, the world of empires and idols, had fallen. In its place, new cultures began to rise. From the ruins of Rome came the seeds of medieval Europe. From the ashes of Persia, new kingdoms emerged. Trade, technology, and belief began to shift, slowly but surely. The hardships reshaped humanity. People learned to live closer to the land, to read the seasons, to fear the power of the earth. Art turned inward, faith turned upward, and science, though still distant, was born from the need to understand what had once destroyed them. Even the myths changed. The Norse remembered the endless winter as Ragnarok, the death and rebirth of the world. Christian monks wrote of divine trials meant to purify mankind. In the East, the Chinese spoke of the breath of heaven, the balance between chaos and renewal. Every culture found its own way to explain what had happened. And in those stories, humanity found healing. But it was not just faith that endured. There was ingenuity. People built better granaries to protect their food from famine. They stored seeds for harder times. They learned to track the sky, to read omens in the weather, to measure the length of shadows. From despair came discipline. From hunger came foresight. From ruin came wisdom. The survivors of the 6th century were not the same people who had entered it. They were tougher, more cautious, more united by the knowledge that the world could end, and yet life would go on. And so it did, slowly, painfully, beautifully. Civilization began to bloom once more beneath the returning sun. Out of the ashes of the 6th century, the world began to breathe again. The sun returned, pale at first, like a ghost learning to live once more. And where ruin had once ruled, something unexpected began to grow. In the east, China rose under the Tang dynasty, a civilization of poets, astronomers, and engineers. They mapped the heavens, built great cities, and revived the pulse of trade that had long gone silent. The Silk Road reopened, not as a scar, but as a lifeline. Threads connecting east and west through commerce and curiosity. In the Middle East, a new faith took root, Islam, carrying with it a culture of learning, architecture, and science that would one day preserve the wisdom of Greece and Rome when Europe forgot it. From the deserts came scholars who charted the stars, studied medicine, and dreamed of flight centuries before the Renaissance. And in Europe, amid the ruins of empire, small kingdoms began to shape themselves anew. The Franks, the Anglo-Saxons, the Byzantines, each forged identity through hardship. Monasteries became islands of knowledge, copying texts by candlelight as storms raged outside. From their patient work, the light of history survived. Even in the far north, among Viking lands, something stirred. Exploration replaced isolation. The spirit that had once burned in ancient empires found new life in the hearts of wanderers and builders. Humanity, scarred but enduring, had learned to adapt, to survive, to begin again. The catastrophe of 536 had stripped the world bare. But in its emptiness, new ideas found space to grow. It was as if the planet itself had pressed a reset, destroying one age to make way for another. From darkness came the seeds of light. From despair, the birth of Renaissance. And from silence, a new song of civilization. History had not ended in the dark year. It had merely paused to take a breath. When it exhaled again, the world that emerged was no longer the same. It was wiser, stronger, and ready for the next chapter of the human story. History is not a straight line. It bends, it breaks, it repeats. The people of 536 did not know they were living through the collapse of a world. They only knew the sun was gone, the cold was endless, and the future uncertain. They could not see the pattern, the rhythm of rise, fall, and rebirth that has always guided humanity. But we can. From the vantage point of our age, surrounded by satellites, data, and the illusion of control, we like to think we've conquered nature. We believe we've mastered the elements that once humbled empires. But the truth is more fragile. The same forces that darkened the world in 536 still sleep beneath our feet. Volcanoes, climate shifts, diseases waiting in the soil, in the ice, in the animals that share our planet. The cycle never ended. We just stopped noticing. When the pandemic of our own century arrived, the echoes of the past returned. Fear, isolation, disbelief, empty streets, silent cities. The same questions whispered across the ages. Why now? Why us? What have we done? But the lesson of 536 is not despair. It is perspective. Civilizations fall, worlds end, and yet, life goes on. The survivors rebuild. The light returns. Every ending is a beginning disguised by shadow. The people who endured the darkest year in history did not have our science, our medicine, or our global reach, and yet they survived. Because endurance is older than technology. It's written in our blood, in our instinct to keep moving forward, even when everything else stops. If the world went dark again tomorrow, not from ash, but from our own making, Would we have the same courage? Would we remember the lessons carved into the ice, the bones, the ruins? That no empire lasts forever, that no comfort is guaranteed, that the earth, not humanity, decides the rules of survival. The story of 536 is not just a record of the past, it's a mirror, a reminder that every generation believes it will be the last until it isn't. And when our own twilight comes, whether by flame, frost, or folly, what will define us will not be how we fell, but how we rose again. Because even in the darkest year in history, the sun eventually returned.